Okay, welcome back, everyone. As we're coming to the close of the decade and this crazy year of 2020, I wanted to talk a little bit about my thoughts as someone who's been collecting military surplus guns for about 8 years now, and some of the experiences I've had putting together my own collection and what has changed over that time. And I mean gun collector in the sense that it's not all about military surplus, which is what I'm predominantly into, but also being a young gun enthusiast in the 2010s, now moving into the 2020s. So much of this is my own anecdotal experiences that I thought I'd share with you. So, just like a lot of people who are into firearms collecting, everyone has a backstory of what got them into the hobby or why they're passionate about firearms. For some people, it's not even about the firearms, it's about the activities that involve the use of firearms, like hunting or reenacting, or just being involved in activities that are secondary to firearms but involve them to a certain degree. Let's say you're into history, you buy a helmet one day at a pawn shop because you think it's cool, it's a neat artifact, and then you start looking more into what an individual in that time period would have worn or used as a rifle. Next thing you know, you want to buy that rifle. A more modern example would be somebody plays Battlefield 1 or watches a movie about World War 1 and now you want to handle a real Lee Enfield number 1 Mark III because now you associate that item with a certain interest of yours. You go buy one, take it to the range, and then meet other people and discover the new thing, something new that you've never heard of. And that's kind of how it evolves for a lot of people. And I'll go into my own experiences here in a minute. And the beauty of collecting is that it's all different. Everyone has different interests. They have different tastes, and it doesn't even have to be historically based. Everyone assumes collectors are only into curio and relic rifles or antiques, or it's for history buffs. In fact, a lot of people like a type of firing system, or collect only those types, or want to focus on sporting weapons. Right. Um, so it is a pretty diverse field, and it varies, pretty dramatically in a lot of cases, depending on one's personal interest, which applies to I think most things in our lives. A quick point that we'll get into later, but in order to be an actual collector, in my opinion, you need to have a focus or a goal to your collection. Just buying random guns doesn't necessarily make you a gun collector. Makes you a gun enthusiast for sure, but not a collector in the true sense of the word that I'm referring to. So, starting a collection. For me, I was really into World War II history as a kid. Still am, but like a lot of millennials that grew up around the turn of the century, you had you had a lot of pop culture movies like Saving Private Ryan with Tom Hanks, Band of Brothers, directed by Steven Spielberg, came out shortly after that, and it really captured the American imagination like the Old West did in with people in the 50s and 60s. I've noticed a lot of older gun collectors are into guns of the West, so that makes sense that it's kind of consistent with the pop culture. It was this kind of bygone era with real heroes and villains, and people really looked at World War II veterans as these people who conquered real evil, which they did. Then people realized they had to capture as many stories from World War II veterans as they could while the majority of them were still alive. Countless biographical books and stories were published in the last 20 years, as well as, World War II themed video games and movies, like we said earlier. You can find these anywhere. And it's still a huge interest. But, really growing up in an era where the majority of like first person shooter video games, World War II themes like Medal of Honor, the early Call of Duty games, and other titles, you get to handle a lot of World War II weaponry. See how they shoot, see how they look, sound, reload. So, the iconic M1 Garand was in every movie and video game. You knew it by heart, and it was so cool looking and sounding, this ideal piece of Americana. Well, when I was a teenager, I was at a shooting range during scout camp, and it was a free shoot day where anyone could bring out anything they wanted. Well, one of the parents brought along their M1 Garand, and I had never seen one in real life. We grew up in a family around guns, living in a fairly rural community, and did some occasional shooting during camp or family gatherings. But no one in the family was really into gun collecting in the way that I laid it out, or really had time or money for it. And so right away when I saw this M1, I asked if I could handle it and shoot it. what a cool opportunity to see a real piece of American history from such an iconic era that everyone was so into at this point, and also operate it. So, fired off a couple rounds, this behemoth 30-06 M1 Garand, the infamous ping from the clip coming out was exactly like the games and the movies that I played as a kid. And right there, I was like, I need to get one of these someday. So, what does any of this have to do with collecting firearms? Well, every collection has an origin story, and pretty much everyone who gets into the hobby doesn't really plan to start a collection. At least from my own experience, they normally just want a gun, and then from there it evolves into wanting another gun, right? So it evolves with your interests that aren't necessarily, they are related to a degree with firearms, but it doesn't necessarily start out that way. It starts out with, okay, you're watching movies and video games, and then you see those items, and you're like, wow, that's really cool. I'm into history, and so I associate that item with that particular subject, right? So years later, I had been saving up, got a job, and when I turned 18, I was pretty determined to buy an M1 Garand, and that's exactly what I did. And I couldn't be happier with it. Now, it wasn't my first gun, but it was, I think, my second or third. But it was, at that time, the thing I was the most proud of that I had owned. And then from there, being into World War II history, I wanted to know more about the other rifles used by the other powers in World War II. A year later, I acquired my second World War II rifle, and Mosin Nagant, manufactured in 1942, for $160 because, why not? They were all cheap, still are to a degree, but back then, I think in like 2014, you could pull, you go to any gun show and they had them in giant racks for like $160 a pop. And it was a cool piece of, they were sitting in a crate at a gun show and you could pick out any you wanted, and you know, it's a cheap way to own a little interesting piece of history. I did this until I had a full collection of the main battle rifles in World War II. So, needless to say, this was not a centrally planned idea from the time I was, 15 years old playing Call of Duty or whatever. But through that, I learned a lot about prices, right? Going to gun shows, what quantities are out there, what does the market look like, what to look for in a rifle, how to gauge condition, uh, and it's kind of a continuous process from there. I don't have to tell many of you that, since many of you are already into military surplus firearms. Now, do I go into gun shops? Do I go to gun shows, pawn shops? These are all questions I was asking myself as uh, I got more and more into military surplus collecting over the years. Based on the area I'm in, where are the best dealers located? And I've been learning about negotiating prices, when to say no to things, and most importantly, networking with people who have this similar interest. If your state has gun collectors associations, I would recommend joining that. Or if there are run and gun clubs nearby, get into one of those. Again, like making connections in the milsurp world is incredibly important. And even if this whatever group you join is into milsurps, just being around firearms, you learn a lot of people. You connect with a lot of people who know a lot of stuff about firearms in general, which is those are good resources to have in this hobby. So that's how a collection started for me. I've moved on to other collection interests such as World War One, the American Civil War. Now I have a better idea over these last 8 years of what I want to start in the future. I'm conscious of my budget restrictions, what to look for in similar rifles that I've purchased. Now that I've had a K98 for about 5 years now, when I'm going through gun shops or gun shows, I can identify like, oh, this one's like in decent condition, or this one's not in good condition. And even if I'm not buying them, I can still handle them. I can still operate them. I can still see what they are. And just being around firearms just gives you you learn something new all the time, and it just gives you a better sense. But you want to really narrow in, especially if you're collecting military surplus. I've learned that you have to kind of narrow on that subject and learn as much as possible about whatever it is. Like I said, if it's World War II collecting, focus on that, narrow on that collection, learn as much as you can about each of those rifles and all the variants, right? So if you want to expand that collection in the future, you know what you're looking for. And again, it's a continuous learning process. So, uh, an interest in collecting is kind of an organic thing. It develops as a result of your other interests and what you've been raised around. But that's my own personal experience. I don't know if anyone from a very young age directly sets the goal of collecting firearms. Um, so, what is a gun collector? Now, something like collecting all the main primary battle rifles from all the major powers in World War II is a pretty standard collection set, right, in the United States. It's not particularly unique in any sense and is something that many people have done and replicated over the years, at least in, again, the United States. These are very readily available items. So this got me thinking, what is the qualifier to be a firearms collector? Is there a standard that needs to be followed? Obviously, buying random guns because you enjoy the hobby and use them doesn't really make you a gun collector. It's not a bad thing at all, but it just makes you a gun enthusiast, not a collector per se. And it doesn't mean those guns aren't serving a direct purpose of yours. Having an array of pistols, rifles, and shotguns can serve a lot of different needs and functions. If you're into three gun, you probably have a lot of different options that support your interest in the hobby in that particular activity. And I can say the same for myself with some of the guns I own. I primarily collect military surplus, but I do have hunting rifles. I do have pistols. There are guns that are outside that purview of my collection areas, but certainly not something I own a lot of. But I would say there are very varying levels of collecting firearms. Of course, you have your person who might want to collect only Mauser rifles, and then maybe only Mauser rifles that were contracted to South America, and then from there only certain like carbines from this manufacturer, or you know uh, one of every year of carbines manufactured by DWM uh, that went to Chile, right? So you can really narrow your collection down as much as you want, and people enjoy that. And then, of course, people complete a collection and they want to start something new. So they'll sell off their collection and start something completely different, like collecting German pocket pistols made between 1920 and like 1940, right? Those collections do exist, and people spend a lot of time researching them. And then you have, I suppose, varying degrees of rigor, right? You have literal scholars and firearms experts. I'm thinking of your like museum curator types, um, but these are more often not public firearms collections, all the way to your budget collector, right? Who knows what they want, but likely only knows surface level information about a firearm or gun. Likes to shoot, for sure, and does have some reading to make sure they're acquainted with what they're handling. Probably have some experience growing up around firearms. Buying a ton of cheap milsurps might just be a way for you to shoot affordably, as it historically has been the case, going back to when surplus guns flooded the United States markets in the 50s and 60s. But that doesn't make you a collector. If that's what your primary motivator is shooting cheap guns, then this is probably a good avenue to do that. So, like me, I'd consider myself a historical gun enthusiast with several CNR collections with random things thrown in there. Like I said, I also do not consider collecting to be an investment for me. It's a hobby. It's something I enjoy. I'm a history enthusiast. If you're buying guns for financial reasons, I'd go ahead and put that money into the stock market because frankly, keeping guns is expensive. It's a time consuming hobby. You have to maintain your property, right? It's a terrible investment. It's to learn and educate yourself about firearms. It's all about fun and being passionate about collecting and learning about what you have and learning new things and being around people who are also equally passionate about firearms. This is a bit subjective, of course, but that's kind of how I see it in my eyes. So, what about deciding what to start on and what to budget for? So, once I started collecting World War II rifles, I kept on that path until it was completed. For the most part, this is knowing prices and conditions for a $160 Mosin. You know you're getting surplus, but I'm also looking at Arisakas and K98s. Wanted to do more research, especially not being too familiar with them, right? So Here's some things that I considered, and I do consider, and am evolving my understanding of these as I, continue to go deeper into the hobby. So, I primarily bought arms from shops or dealers that I trusted, right? This doesn't guarantee anything necessarily because you still have to be smart about what you're doing, but at least you can start building relationships with local vendors. Um, that is, I would highly recommend this, especially if you know that you're going to be in one area. If there's a gun show that is reoccurring in your area and the same vendors frequent it a lot, get to know those vendors, talk to them. You know, Start a conversation. Ask them about ask them about what they've got in stock. Touch the guns, handle them. This is a really good way, and if you visit those people over time, they're going to recognize you. This is something I've experienced going to a local gun show of mine, where now vendors say, "Oh, hey, I think I remember you from last time." So that is usually a good sign. That doesn't mean those people are always trustworthy, but at least you're starting to build relationships. I familiarized myself with the product I wanted, right? So reading online, watching videos on YouTube, reading books, asking people who know what they're talking about. Online, there's almost unlimited number of resources on firearms history and collecting. Of course, books are still the most important source, but much of that has been transferred online in different ways. What variants exist? Does it have a carbine counterpart? What is the difference between milsurps and like sporterized guns? There's also a lot of nonsense online too, so take that with a grain of salt. So sticking with accredited authors is the best way to go, or people who consider themselves experts. You can, go to a gun show and quickly like look up. I mean, the internet does make it easier to look up certain markings on guns, but being familiar with the handling of that particular firearm and, you know, being familiar with it in general is going to be better than going to a gun show and looking for something when you have no knowledge about that firearm at all. So going into like research what other people are paying for the same thing. Go to Gunbroker, look at online auctions, look at index values. All these resources are, again, all available online. Go to gun stores, shows, and look at everything. Doing this year to year will give you a pretty good range, more than like a typical person just buying the first thing they see. So, going to a gun shop in 2014, there's a Gewehr 98 in extremely good condition for $500, and then noticing that in 2020, that would be a fantastic, almost impossible price to find something like that. Same with Mosins. Again, in 2014, 2015, you could go to a gun store or a gun show and find crates of them for like $100 or $200. Now you go and they're still cheap, of course, but they're now like 300, sometimes $400 if you go to some of the bigger retail stores. Um, when you go to potentially purchase or look for something, go with a friend who knows what they're doing or knows what they're talking about. This will give you more leverage in a discussion. I've found with a vendor, and they usually know what the right questions to ask. Watch and observe. I cannot recommend this enough. If you have a friend who is, let's say, into Italian firearms, go with them and have them look at this vendor. Let's say it's a vendor you've never encountered before, don't know them. Yeah, have your friend go with you. That means you just have more knowledge. I mean, it just gives you an advantage, right? They can tell you, especially if you go up and it looks like you know what you're talking about. Indeed, you should know what you're talking about before you purchase a rifle. The other thing too is talk with other collectors, get involved in the community, and make friends. I guess I've reiterated this in different ways, in different forms, but you got to make connections with other people in this hobby if you're serious about it. Again, uh, it's all, everyone lives in different parts of the country, and maybe some of you are from outside the country, but there's going to be communities everywhere of people who are interested in military surplus firearms or firearms in general. As I said, join a club, get involved. If there's a collectors association in your state, try to go to their meetings, make connections with people, because these are the people that are usually at the gun shows. These are people that you're going to see reoccurringly over these years, and they're going to be good resources for you. Now, on prices, the only thing you might have noticed, and a lot of milsurp collectors have, is the increasing price. And this is something that I think has been oversaturated on YouTube with people just talking about prices going up and up and up. So since I started buying milsurps in 2013, prices have obviously risen steadily. On average, I still pay probably under $500 for one of these old war horses. Like I'm thinking like Chilean Mausers or whatever, and you can still find ammo for them like relatively cheap, and you can find plenty of deals. Right, they're still around if you look, but prices are increasing for military surplus. Again, this is why it's good for you to specialize and focus your collection. Do not expect to find any World War One or World War Two guns for under $300 in 2020, which was $3. Even Mosins and Carcanos, right? My recent purchase was a Carcano M91 Trupe Speciale. Bought it for 245 plus shipping. The FFL came to probably around $300. That is a pretty good deal for 2020. It's probably not going to be around too much longer. Forget about Enfields and Mausers; they've gone up quite a bit. I was just telling you the story about the Gewehr 98, which they've probably doubled, if not tripled, in prices. I got my first Lee Enfield dated 1941 BSA for $250 in 2014 or 2015. It wasn't in the greatest condition, but it was operable and it had a very decent bore. And now they're about $700 for a nice example. 700 to 800, sometimes $900 for a Lee Enfield. For a number one Mark III, sorry. Number four Mark Ones are still, I think, like in that $500 range, but they are going up. They are, like I said, military surplus are now collector's items, and that's kind of, it's not going to change. Obviously, conditions can cause prices to go up or down, but assume constant inflation on pretty much all of these. Um, Prices are going up for obviously a number of reasons. I'm not going to go too much into this because people have there's already a million videos out there about this, but first, they only made a finite number of these things, right? With the hobby becoming increasingly popular, that doesn't help ease the current consumption of supply. The intent has been the internet has made collecting and information gathering on these rifles much easier, and now it's more affordable. So sellers can better identify what they have and what to charge. And what you couldn't do before, I mean, you couldn't do this before the age of the internet, of course, unless this was something you spent a lot of time doing and researching. This means you're less likely to find something underpriced now. I mean, I was not into collecting in the days of the early 2000s or the 90s, before the age of the internet, where you could just go into a gun show or a gun store with your iPhone and look up prices, right? The sellers probably knew the market a little bit better, and there were obviously buyers who knew price markets very well if they were into the hobby for a long time. But going into like a pawn shop where someone undervalues something they're selling is going to be less and less likely now with the internet and everyone having access easily, you know, easier access to supply and demand. And like I said at the beginning, movies and pop culture have also affected the market. The World War One centennial, starting in 2014, games like Battlefield One caused a lot of World War One Great War rifles to increase in value. The Gewehr 98s, and everything like saying Gewehr 98s, Lee Enfields, 1903s. These are all, you're not going to find these for under $600. Maybe some of the like the Carcanos, obviously, for like 300, but you're gonna probably be paying more than $1,000 for these fairly soon. Artificial demand driven by people trying to buy milsurps before the prices go up even further drives the prices up even further. So, in that sense, it's a hoarding market, but people want them before they're generally unavailable at these lower prices. So it's a bit self-perpetuating, but the only thing that seems to stop this is an an economic downturn. I'm very guilty of this last point. Over the last 4 years, I've been buying within my collection purviews, which is good, but very much assuming that they won't always be there. For my World War One collection, when I started in 2018, I think, I basically grabbed my first 1886 Lebel I saw and the first Gewehr 98 I saw. While I paid about market price for both of these items, I didn't really care to wait for other options, especially if I only wanted one example for each of my collections, as long as it was like period correct. But that's supply and demand, and that's the law. So without harping on that point too much, don't let this stop you from meeting your collection goals. It may not be feasible to pick up a 1941 Johnson rifle, but you can still find the most of everything out there, and it's all has a price. So, if you have to wait a little bit longer, if you have to maybe not get a gun that's in the best condition because it's not in your budget, make sure you build a realistic goal. And also, if you're going to focus on a certain collection type, make sure it's a collection that you can afford. If you're going to be buying guns made in the American Revolutionary time, you're probably going to be spending a couple $1,000s per rifle. If that is not in your budget range, I would recommend trying to focus on something that is a little bit more feasible. And maybe you aren't walking away from a gun show with like 6 different guns, but it means you know what your budget and limitations are. You know what you want. Do your research, and you'll eventually get there. So, going forward, what do I expect for myself as I continue building my own collections? Well, continue learning from mistakes, making connections, and having fun. Again, it's a fun hobby. I mean, collecting firearms from hundreds of years ago, or at least 100, going back over 100 years. It's so cool seeing these different items, learning about the different people that use them, how they were made, who made them, the different manufacturing techniques, and also the aesthetic beauty of these rifles, the wood and the steel, and I mean, everything that draws you in, and also shooting. Shooting is also an important component of this. Not that you have to necessarily shoot all your rifles that you are collecting, because that again could affect the value depending on what your collection purview is. But it is a fun hobby. So thanks for listening in, and be looking out for more content as 2020 is shortly coming to a close. Thanks, guys.